Maryland Attorney General Anthony Brown. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be on with you, Luke.
So 4 years. This report has been in the works for 4 years. This office has been working and has found some pretty staggering facts and details. 600 victims of sexual abuse at the hands of over 150 priests and members of the Archdiocese of Baltimore. Tragic, awful, and hard to understand. And before we go into the depths of this report, I want to first lay out what a priest actually means. Statistically, many of my listeners aren't part of the Catholic Church, but the priest holds power, holds influence, especially within the context of a church community. Can we first define that relationship and the meaning of what a priest is?
Sure. Well, first of all, Luke, thanks for covering this very important issue, and that's the interim report that we released this week that really was a reckoning, a public accounting of decades worth of abuse by priests. Not just priests, also seminarians, deacons, other employees of the Archdiocese of Baltimore. But the question of priests, right? And that it's about a relationship, right? And that relationship may vary from person to person. I happen to be Catholic, and the relationship that I had with my priest growing up was one who I looked to as not only the leader of the parish, the congregation, of the church as I knew it and was experiencing it, a spiritual leader and someone who reflected the values that were taught through the Catholic Church, whether in Mass on Sunday or school, if you went to a Catholic school, about the values that were that stem from Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So people see in a priest someone who they can trust, someone who they can have confidence with, a confidential relationship, right? Think about the confessional and what you confide in a priest that you may not confide in anyone else in your life. An advisor, sometimes a mentor, a coach, someone who is in a position of trust, and that trust was abused in the Archdiocese of Baltimore.
Now, to the report itself, to my reading, it's a 500-page report, but there are two main findings. One, detailed incidences of sexual abuse, and two, a cover-up. These are the two main kind of movements of this report. Let's first talk about these incidences. Each are individual and different from one another, but they follow similar trends. Can you lay out for us, what that trend was and what this report really found?
Sure, and I think you're right. I mean, of the 600 survivors who we interviewed, after we, back in 2018, we had an email address, a hotline telephone that people could call into, and we had, 600 survivors, countless witnesses who led to many other survivors and witnesses for us to interview over a 4-year process. And what we heard were very unique stories. Some of them involved physical abuse, some of them literally torture, emotional and psychological abuse, sexual abuse for sure. Each one, though, was unique, but we do see common patterns. And the pattern is of a priest, or in the case of some cases, there was a coach who abused their power and authority that they had over some of the most vulnerable people you can imagine, and that's children. And again, children who look to that priest, who look to the church for safety and sanctuary.
And it's worth noting, too, I'm also Catholic, and they're called Father, and in the tradition of the Mass, they invoke Christ. They become God for some seconds, and you're taught that, too. So it really underlines that role. Now, moving on to the cover-up. When I read this report, I was personally shocked by the cover-up within the church, but also how the church, from the 50s to the 90s, contacted judges, contacted journalists, and orchestrated these cover-ups for so long. Can you talk about that aspect of the report?
Sure. So, and I mentioned that, from 2018 to when we finalized the report, initially when we sent it to the circuit court the end of 2022, We reviewed hundreds of thousands of documents, transfer reports, treatment reports, personnel files, policies, and procedures. And what we saw and where we focused was really on the Archdiocese of Baltimore, the decisions made by the Catholic Church hierarchy. And we saw these intentional, deliberate efforts to conceal and hide known abuse, in some cases excusing it as a minor lapse or equating it to alcoholism that could be treated in some simple, 10-step program, which I think is of value when you're talking about alcoholism, but proves to be unsuccessful when you talk about pedophilia. And even when these issues were brought to the authorities of local prosecutors, law enforcement, at least in one case, a judge, and even a newspaper, they were ignored. And we see no evidence in many cases where anything substantive or serious was done of that matter. And what we saw was that the defense, if you will, the excuse offered by the abuser was given much more weight than the claims that were being made by the abused. In some cases, suggesting that the abused and/or their family were, non-Catholics or non-believers, and discounting the abusers. The survivors, the abused, the survivors, as incredible.
Yeah, and a third step, kind of in this tragic progression, is at some points these priests and those who work for the Archdiocese were moved after an incident was reported, no accountability was given, and then they were moved and sometimes aggressed again. It's just hard to believe, really. It really is.
Yeah, it really is. And I agree with you. When you look at some of these personnel moves, some of them were from one parish to another within the Archdiocese, literally from one community to another. Others were moves outside of the Archdiocese that may or may not have included a short stay at a treatment center, supposedly to treat the priest, where we see the evidence in many cases proved, as you stated in your question, repeat abuse even after this purported treatment. So it was an effort more to protect the reputation, the position of the institution, the church, the Archdiocese, than it was in protecting the children who were violated in such a depraved and sadistic way.
And it should be noted that the time frame of this investigation is around from the 1950s to the 90s here. And in the report, I also noted a subsection where there was an evolution of law surrounding sexual abuse, and how that evolution of the law, also revealed more and more how pervasive this sexual assault was within, the church. Can you talk about that progression at all?
So the law in Maryland that defines the criminal offenses of rape, of sexual assault, has evolved over the years. And most of the abuse that happened in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, through the 90s, back then, some of it would not have been met today's definition of rape.
Right.
And as a result, those offenses were considered misdemeanors. And that is what ties my hands as the Attorney General in bringing indictments, because misdemeanors have a 1-year statute of limitations. Had they been considered felonies at the time, there's no statute of limitations, and I would be able to not only investigate, but seek indictments and prosecute where the evidence would support a prosecution. But as you mentioned, the law has changed in Maryland for the better, because now this conduct today that we have reported on in great detail in our report would rise to the level of felony. And it also applies to, because I often get the question, well, what about criminal prosecution against the Archdiocese as an institution? Some notion of conspiracy or accessory after the fact. But there, too, that conspiracy is a misdemeanor, and accessory after the fact actually doesn't apply for misdemeanors. So there's right now no evidence that we have that would enable us to bring a criminal prosecution against the Archdiocese of Baltimore.
In other words, it's locked in time, locked in the past, legally speaking.
Short of any new information that is more current, we, based on the evidence that we have, the information that we have, criminal indictments and prosecutions against abusers and the Archdiocese of Baltimore right now is not available.
And this progression of the law, continued in the hours after this report was released. The Maryland legislature passed a bill that would kind of extend the statutes of limitation for some of these sexual assault incidences. It needs Governor Moore's, signature to become law. What would that do? What impact would that have on what's covered in this report?
Yes, and to be clear, the statute of limitations that you're speaking of is the statute of limitations for civil cases.
Sorry, yes.
Yep, civil actions that a survivor may bring against an abuser or the Catholic Church. And about a month ago, I sent a letter of advice to the General Assembly saying that if they eliminate the statute of limitations, I am confident that I can defend that in a court of law, because there are questions about whether or not you can change or eliminate the statute of limitations. And we opine and we feel confident that you can. 1 hour after we released the report, the General Assembly, in fact, did pass that law, and my office is prepared to defend it. That applies to civil actions taken by those who were abused by the priests and seminarians and deacons. When it comes to criminal offenses, you cannot go back and change the statute of limitations.
To be clear.
To be clear.
And, so again, this timeline that I underlined earlier, 1950s to 1990s, I think a big question in so many people's minds now when they look around after reading this report is, has this stopped? Has the church reformed? Did the report unveil anything, new past this timetable? Can you give any assurances or some understanding about the now portion of Archdiocese of Baltimore?
Sure. Look, it's not my position to give assurances about the Archdiocese of Baltimore or any other, non-governmental institution that's not my client. And even when they are my client, sometimes it's hard to give assurances. But what I can tell you is that among the hundreds of thousands of documents that we reviewed, the type of depraved and sadistic treatment and abuse that we saw trailed off significantly after 2002. And we see the greatest numbers predating 2002 in the mid to early 1990s, 1980s, and of course going back decades. So I don't want to be the one who says that whether the Archdiocese of Baltimore has reformed to a level that there's no abuse. I don't want to suggest that there is necessarily abuse happening today. I can tell you that again, among the hundreds of thousands of documents that we reviewed, we saw a significant trail off after 2002.
Now, this report is revealing. It creates some transparency, and we heard from victims at WTOP who said just that this is a relief in some sense. But on the other side of that same coin is there's still more accountability to be had. So what's left on the table legally that your office can do to, hold people accountable that did these awful things?
Well, a few things. First of all, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the release of this report, as I heard from the survivors with whom I met before the release, this for many was a relief, yet pain and suffering continues. It was a reckoning. Many of the survivors had told their story on countless occasions. For some of the survivors, the first time they told their story was when they told it to one of our investigators or attorneys. It was a public accounting with a level of detail not seen before. So the survivors, and I can't speak for the survivors, but in the conversation I had with the survivors, there was a level of gratitude that finally their stories were being heard. In terms of going forward, and we were asked by the survivors, we've got an investigation in the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., which covers portions of Maryland and the National Capital Region, the Diocese of Wilmington, Delaware, that covers Maryland's Eastern Shore and some northeastern counties. We still have an ongoing investigation. We have issued subpoenas at the same time that we did for the Archdiocese of Baltimore. We did not sit idle. My predecessor, Brian Frosch, I think rightfully so, decided to focus most of the attention and the resources of the office on Baltimore to complete that. But now we continue in the investigation. So that's one thing, and we'll see what we uncover, and whether or not there will be indictments coming out of that investigation or not. It's too premature for me to say.
We still don't know.
We still don't know. But there is the opportunity for, again, because of the action of the General Assembly, for survivors to bring civil action. We also invite those who are listening, those who are watching, those who are reading. If you're a survivor also or a witness to any of these accounts, we're encouraging people to come forward. Because while we have submitted the interim report with some redactions made public, I should say, we made public this interim report, we still invite those who have information about abuse in the Archdiocese of Baltimore to come forward.
Now, if you flip through this nearly 500-page report, you will see some redactions, some black blocks blocking names. What do those mean, and will those ever be revealed? What's the issue there?
So I'll start with the latter part of the question, and there is it's certainly possible and maybe even probable that those redacted names will be revealed, and let me explain why they're redacted. As I mentioned, we went through hundreds of thousands of pages of documents. The lion's share of those were produced by the Archdiocese of Baltimore through a grand jury subpoena, and as you and many of your listeners or viewers know, that information that's obtained through a grand jury is secret and confidential, and it can only be revealed upon order or permission of the court. So that's why we've been working in the Circuit Court of Baltimore City for 4 months to have the report disclosed. So what the entirety of the report, what the court has ordered is, in the case of those redacted names, and the names were found by us, discovered by us through this secret grand jury process, to give those people an opportunity to look at the context in which they are included in the report and to file objections with the court. So we will notify these individuals to give them that opportunity to do it, and rest assured that our office will certainly make the strong case for removing the redactions or disclosing those names, and ultimately the decision will be made by the court.
Now, before we move on to a few other topics here within your office's purview, any final thoughts on this report?
It's been one of the most difficult things that I've had to address in my 20-plus years of public service. I was pleased to read 4 years ago, when Brian Frosch, my predecessor, working with then Governor Hogan, committed the resources to undertake this investigation. And I just want the people, survivors, and the public to know that I am committed to completing the investigations of the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. and the Diocese of Wilmington, Delaware in as expeditious and thorough manner as possible.
Now, moving on and switching gears a little bit, the Maryland House of Delegates also voted, in the hours after the report, to give your office the power and authority to prosecute fatal incidents involving police. And that's instead of the state locals' attorneys. What will that move, if signed by Governor Moore, allow your office to do?
So just backing up a little bit, 2 years ago, the Maryland General Assembly gave the Office of the Attorney General the authority to investigate police-involved deaths, and then they expanded that to incidences that could likely result in death. So what Brian Frosch did is he established the Independent Investigation Division, and that's what we do. as of our most recent annual report, because we've been in existence now for close to 18 months, maybe a little longer. In our first report, we reported on 24 or 25 such investigations. It's our responsibility to independently investigate. We work with the Maryland State Police. We have our own investigators, and then we send a detailed investigative report analyzing the facts and the law to the local prosecutor, who decides whether or not to prosecute that police officer in that particular case. This year, what the General Assembly just did is they extended to my office and the Independent Investigation Division the authority to prosecute those cases. We now have once the governor signs the bill into law, we will now have the exclusive authority to act on that investigation.
And why is that important?
It's important. It's a best practice. And I think while you saw the state's attorneys around Maryland oppose this bill, they opposed the investigation authority 2 years ago. They opposed transferring the prosecutorial authority this year. Notwithstanding their public opposition, I believe that most prosecutors would tell you that it is a best practice for the prosecutor who's involved and leading, in some cases, the investigation to actually do the prosecution, because the investigation shapes the kind of prosecution that you are going to pursue in court. So it's a best practice, number one. Number two, it instills even greater confidence in the public about the integrity of the investigation, the prosecution. And I can tell you, while there was opposition from the Fraternal Order of Police, at the end of the day, I think this is a good thing for police officers, because when the Attorney General informs the public that after a thorough investigation, a decision is made not to prosecute, I think that carries significant weight, and I think is of value and important for members of law enforcement.
And it dawns on me, not to relate these two entities, the Catholic Church and the police, but the Attorney General's office is tasked with investigating organizations that have lots of power, in our communities. Can you talk about that aspect of your job and your office's job?
I would say, when someone asks me, what is the role of the Attorney General? And we are, in large part, as the chief legal officer of the state, to enforce the rule of law. This notion that no one is above the law. No institutions are above the law, no matter how revered they are. No institution or member of an institution is above the law, no matter how important a role that they play in our societies and in our communities. And the Attorney General is one of several players, but I would say perhaps one of the most predominant players in Maryland, in any state, that ensures that we abide by the laws, the rules, the regulations that govern civil conduct in a society. That's our job. That's my job.
And it's an interesting time, I think, because what this report shows is that sometimes people were above the law, and there's some instances within police. Sometimes it seems to the public that some police are above the law in the past. Going all the way up to the top with President Trump in that recent indictment in New York. Is this a notable time where the law needs to be reestablished? I don't know if that's a broad enough claim to make.
Well, I think if you look through the history of our nation, there have been times where the rule of law has been shirked, seemingly more so than at other times, right? You can go back to the Nixon-Watergate era and, a president who believed that he was above the law, and then our most recent, 45th president who believed the same thing. So it ebbs and flows, and not just at the federal level, but at state and local level. So you need the Attorney General, and you need state's attorneys. They enforce criminal laws. You need all public officials, county executives, and members of the General Assembly. We are and should be held to a higher, if not the highest standard of ethical conduct, and that is our responsibility to enforce ethics, to enforce the rule of law.
Attorney General Anthony Brown, thank you so much.
Thanks, Luke.